In August 2018, the American Psychological Association published guidelines for psychological practice with boys and men. The document was marred by its all-out hostility to what it portrays as traditional masculinity, failing to provide a fair and accurate picture of the strengths and flaws of masculinity. By portraying masculinity as something apparently entirely learned and even an ideology, the guidelines go against scientific evidence and distort knowledge to suit an agenda. My guest for this episode, John Paul Wright, is a professor of criminal justice, and he explains how these guidelines are unhelpful. Hi everyone, I'm thrilled to be here with Professor John Paul Wright. John, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So you are now Professor of Criminal Justice at the University of Cincinnati, correct?
I am. I've been
good.
For 20 years.
Okay, good. So my information is correct. And so you received your PhD in 1996 from the same university.
That's correct.
Yeah, and the title of your thesis was Parental Support and Juvenile Delinquency, a Test of Social Support Theory.
Correct.
And your research has covered topics such as social and biological factors of criminality, using findings from several disciplines, so psychology, biology, etc. And so we want to talk about a recent event, which is that a few months ago, the American Psychological Association released a document which offered guidelines, as they call them, for psychological practice with boys and men. And these guidelines have come under quite a bit of criticism. And so this will be the topic of the discussion, and maybe we can start just by trying to understand what this document was, what was its nature and its stated purpose.
Yeah, well, some time ago, and just to be clear, I am not a psychologist. I do not treat people. I study crime, and by that, generally study the bad behavior of men and women. But the APA originally released a document on treatment guidelines for women. And I believe this may have been 12 to 18 years ago. But if you read that document, it's fairly empirically based. It identifies some unique needs that women have in terms of counseling and rehabilitation, what have you. And it was reasonably scientifically based. Mm-hmm. More recently, they followed up with a document for treatment guidelines for men and boys.
Right.
And if you compare and contrast those two documents, they are somewhat as different as night and day, in the sense that the document, treatment guidelines for men and boys, is a mix of some scholarship, some social critique, and a whole lot of what many of us believe is sort of this progressive ideological talking points. Mm. And it went so far as to identify masculinity in and of itself as a risk factor to a whole host of various problems, and especially they call out what they refer to as traditional masculinity.
Right.
So in the treatment, as you might imagine, of men and boys, therapists are called on to take toxic masculinity and address it immediately, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so, but this document is intended as well as the name indicates. These are guidelines, right? They are not supposed to be sort of binding for therapists.
That's correct. And in discussing this with my friends in psychology and practicing psychologists, that's not really the problem. If you want to identify it as a problem, the problem is that this is now going to be taught and institutionalized in psychology programs across the United States. And the APA sort of license these programs and will look to see, are you teaching about traditional masculinity and the evils of traditional masculinity? So it's in some ways, I don't know if this was the intention. I don't think so. But it was a backdoor way of getting this type of progressive ideology institutionalized into the teaching structure in psychology programs.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand correctly, it means that in universities, these psychology programs, they look to what the APA recommends, and they heed these guidelines, right?
Yes, and in terms of accreditation, APA accreditation will most likely require these guidelines to be taught.
Okay, I did not know that there was such a thing as APA accreditation.
Yeah, in the United States, we like to accredit everything. So
okay, and so I mean, should I understand that most psychology programs at universities which are regarded as at least decent are accredited?
That's my understanding.
Right.
And you can understand why there's treatment of individuals that are involved. There are, a whole host of moral, ethical issues that therapists need to be aware of. So there's, as a mechanism to ensure the quality of psychology programs dedicated to the treatment of individuals and counseling programs, having some degree of oversight is not necessarily in and of itself a bad thing.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So maybe we can, delve a bit more into the details of the document. So you mentioned already that it features heavily this phrase, and it discusses this notion at length of traditional masculinity, which from the moment where it's introduced onwards, the reader is made to understand that it's at least mostly, if not exclusively, this you could give more details, but at least mostly a negative. So the first point where they define it, I think they immediately say that it's that traditional masculinity is opposed to femininity. It's focused on achievement, risk, and adventure, and it's also violent and eschewing weakness. So maybe you can comment on that if you want.
Yeah. Well, before I do, let me back up and put this into broader context, and that is, if you look into this body of research in this area of literature, what you will find is this term masculine ideology. And that masculinity is an ideology that is either taught or culturally created or reinforced, but boys and males essentially have a choice into how much they buy into it and the extent to which they buy into it. And masculine ideology, if you can almost equate it to a political ideology, right? It sets out certain goals and means to those goals and justifications for the means to those goals. So that in and of itself could be useful in thinking about. But the question really is masculine ideology a thing? Can we measure it? Can we, if we can measure it, is it reliable? Does it meet all the standard scientific criteria for measurement? And then more importantly, applied to treatment, if you change it, does it matter? Does it lead to better outcomes? Now, these are important scientific questions. But at its root, masculine ideology was developed as a way expressly to sort of take away biology from the question. So in various writings, the argument is that masculine ideology has nothing to do with biology.
Mm-hmm.
Masculinity has nothing to do with biology. And that in and of itself is a fairly erroneous conclusion, probably not supported by data. So they wanted to take biology out of the picture. They move into this idea of masculine ideology, and then that gives us the move into this type of traditional masculinity, which they define in very negative terms. And you mentioned some of them, risk taking and achievement, violence, the use of violence, and they mentioned, I believe, in the document, sexual assault, and essentially achieving status or power, what have you, through means that are rather antisocial and often criminal.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes almost the opposite of masculinity or traditional masculinity.
Right. Yeah. So just to discuss this point in a bit in some more detail, the point about the role of biology, because I was curious about what they would say about it. I'm aware that discussing the role of biology in shaping people's personalities is not always popular. Let's just put it this way in some academic circles.
Yeah.
Let's go for this very weak formulation of the the diagnosis. And they do mention it a little bit, and it doesn't seem that they reject it entirely, but at the same time, the first sort of they call it guideline. Actually, the first guideline which they expand on, is takes this view that you just explained, which is that masculinity is sort of seen as an ideology or as a habit of mind. So it's saying that people or men or males are sort of more or less free, at least in principle, to adopt it to various degrees. So, but they mentioned biology just a little bit, right? I don't know if you remember. Certainly, I think in as much as factors of violence are concerned, they don't exclude it completely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me perhaps put it in the context that I work in the most, and that is in crime. We've known forever that males cross time, culture, place, situation are on average far more violent, engage in more violence, or the victims of violence, aggression, and so forth. And that this is true pretty much wherever you go, and always has been. And as I like to tell my students, socialization is not that perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And there's probably something about being male at and something biological and genetic that predisposes males to risk-seeking, novelty-seeking, aggression and violence. And if you link this to what we know about human evolution, it kind of makes sense. And that doesn't necessarily mean that every male is primed, obviously, and so forth, but that there are clear scientific reasons to believe that biology plays an intricate role in male aggression and in the differences between male and female aggression. And to sort of ignore that and replace it, if you will, with a new idea of people selecting their masculinity seems scientifically questionable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if they has chosen to discuss both biological and social factors, one could be very favorable to such a combined approach, but it doesn't seem that this was the privileged approach.
No, it certainly was not. And again, if you actually read the literature that they cite and the books that they cite, it's fairly explicit in its rejection of biological influences on these differences. But and this goes to sort of the content of the document, that's its scientific credibility. When I was in graduate school, the theory explaining male-female differences in aggression and violence was socialization, right? We socialize males one way, we socialize females another, and there were all sorts of sort of anecdotes and explanations. The Bobo dolls, I remember explicitly. You see kids punching these Bobo dolls, plastic dolls with a sand base, and they hit them, and the doll comes back. And to this day, if I see a Bobo doll in the store, I'm tempted. Nonetheless, what a lot of the studies indicated was that that's kind of an irrelevant thing. And that really what we do is we socialize men to not be violent, to control their violence, to control the aggression. And then the question is, how do we do that? And how we do that most effectively? Because you're never necessarily going to eliminate it, and it would not be a good idea if you did. So the literature that they cite, and the APA cites in this document and so forth, comes from a very small, very narrow area of psychology that is largely uninformed and detached from the broader areas of psychology and lifespan development and neurological development and biological influences. And that part of the problem was it's a very, very narrow part of psych that is also infused with a very strong feminist orientation.
Okay. So I think we've covered the point about biology. Maybe we can come back to it if it's relevant later, but we can maybe focus a little bit more on the what they see, what this document sees as the the two big problems with traditional masculinity, namely that one, it makes men harmful, according to them, and two, it actually harms men themselves. So this is the sort of double jeopardy that they see as characterizing traditional, so to say, as they call it, masculinity.
Yeah, and let's be clear about what they're referring to in terms of traditional masculinity. Men that are sort of buying into, if you will, common conventional roles that men play in their psychological adaptations. For example, they call out, the stoic type of male who I guess from their point of view, suppresses their emotions and doesn't allow them to come out and what have you. The type of male that uses force or aggression or intimidation to achieve some type of goal, regardless of the cost, regardless of what the price is to other people. This has somehow been converted into this idea of traditional masculinity. Now, I think reasonable people can agree that there are hyper-masculine men that sometimes engage in conduct and behavior that is not only inappropriate but criminal. Just as there are men on the flip side of this that engage in behaviors that are quite destructive to themselves and to others, but they would never define traditional femininity in very negative terms, or to define traditional femininity by its worst characteristics. Not so with men. And this is, I think, part of the rub for a lot of people. Traditional masculinity, an argument could be made, has provided society with tremendous stability, advancement, safety, clear mechanisms for responsibility and accountability, and that indeed there are aspects to traditional masculinity that are very noble, very noteworthy, and that many, many men ascribe to and want to ascribe to in a very healthy, positive, and supportive way.
It's very much an aside, but I'm not really sure actually that they would, embrace traditional femininity more than traditional masculinity. I'm guessing there is a strong chance that the people who wrote these guidelines, there is a strong chance probably that they would see traditional femininity, so to say, as constraining to women, something that is imposed from the top down, and
yes,
that these are sort of restrictive roles and arbitrary roles, and that actually the less women sort of embrace them, the better. So maybe there's actually sort of a symmetry here, which is the idea that in either case these gender roles, so to say, are completely or at least largely nefarious. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, and really my reference point was actually that prior report that I mentioned on the guidelines for working with women, and that and those were written some time ago. And they do draw out some of the things about gender roles and legitimate issues around some roles that are kind of ridiculous and harmful and what have you. But my point is that if you define masculinity, traditional masculinity, in very, very negative terms, right, that says something about the orientation of the scholars. Clearly, masculinity can produce problems. That's why we, in many ways, the criminal justice systems that we have are about the control of male behavior. And there are substantial penalties associated for men when they behave badly. So there is something about that we understand. But would they today come out and say publicly that toxic femininity or traditional femininity is a bad thing for women, and that it causes all of these other types of problems, and that it interferes with their willingness to find help and seek support, solutions? This I'm not sure of.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not certain. You can bash men all you want to in the academy, right? In academia, and be patted on the back, but criticize females and you're in for it.
Maybe, this is just a guess, but maybe there is a sense that in as much as traditional masculinity is bad, that these male gender roles are seen as bad, there is still this idea that men can choose to, whether they want to embrace them or not, while maybe there is a notion that these restrictive gender roles for women, women don't really get a choice whether they want to follow them. This is just my guess, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and you'll actually, if you compare the documents, you'll see that, right? Men are choosing this type of masculinity, where women, if that type of femininity is imposed on them, right? And the roles are imposed on them, and it's the lack of choice. So you sort of do have those competing explanatory narratives.
Yeah, fair enough. So, in what ways? So I think we understand at least a little bit now how the document argues that traditional masculinity tends to make men harmful, and so how do they argue that it also harms men themselves?
in large part because that stoic male attitude of handling problems and suppressing your emotions cuts them off from sources of support that the APA apparently approves of. That they're less likely to seek out psychological counseling for their problems. And to be fair, I think it is fair to say that men are oftentimes more reluctant to seek out professional help for a variety of reasons. Some of them having to do with that stoic, I can handle almost anything type of thing, but also because, there's a cost to men sometimes in professional terms. There's a cost socially sometimes, not always, and that therapy for men is still a relatively new thing.
Okay.
And there has to be trust, right? And this is actually part of the problem with that document. Yeah. That is, psychology is heavily dominated by women and people on the left. Nothing wrong with that, right? But if you're that traditional male and you're going to an individual to seek psychological help, counseling, support through a difficult period of life, you have to put a lot of trust in the person that you're seeing, who is a complete stranger. And part of the problem with this document is that it may inadvertently, because I don't believe this was their intention at all, but it may inadvertently create the very conditions that prevent men from seeking help when they need it. And that's really my ultimate concern. Right. Is when you define the essence of being a man as problematic and then say, but we can help you, men are just not going to respond to that, or the men that you want to seek help are not going to respond to that.
Yes, there is this, I don't know where this sentence was uttered. Maybe you can help me with that, but I read part of the Quillette article, which is a compilation of reactions from scientists and academics to the APA guidelines, and there is this short text by Pamela Peresky. I don't know how to pronounce it. Yeah, Pamela Peresky. And she says, so she mentions one of the authors, I think, of the guidelines. His name is Ryan McDermott, and he was one of the people who drafted the guidelines. He's, of course, a psychologist, and he said, apparently it was in a publication by the APA, that the guidelines have this overarching ulterior motive, which is that, quote, if we can change men, we can change the world, end quote.
Yes, which presupposes, I believe Pamela brought this out, that there's something wrong with men. And let me say this. We as in Western cultures, we've paid a lot of attention to promoting the interests of women, to opening up career paths, educational paths that were often closed off, that have been historically closed off to them, and they've excelled. There's no doubt that this expansion of opportunity for women has led to more women in college, more women graduate now with college degrees than do men.
Yeah.
And that has provided tremendous, I guess, social equity and given women newfound opportunities. And that focus on all that change is great. But there have also been very, very important changes for men. In fact, I would argue that many of the social changes have affected men more than women, and oftentimes in very positive ways. Anecdotally, my grandfather worked in a factory, was drafted, went off to World War II, came home, worked in that same factory for 30 years, and I believe at the same job as well. no time for vacation, not a lot of time to invest in kids, very physically punishing work. Today, what do we have? Men get to spend time with their children. They get to be part of their children's lives often. They have many more career opportunities. Very few men actually work in hard industrial labor compared to what it used to be, although they're predominantly still in there, disproportionately still in there. So there have been many changes that men have endured and benefited from that get completely overlooked because of the focus on the number of men committing crimes or doing bad things. So these changes have benefited men in a lot of ways. But I would also say this, and that is there's this current undercurrent in Western society that is perhaps anti-male is too strong, but free criticism for males in various ways. And you'll see this in the document where they talk about power and privilege and what have you, that therapists should be aware of how power and privilege shapes the male personality or sets of attitudes. And again, here, this is not necessarily science. This is pretty much ideology.
Right.
Are there men that are powerful and have a lot of course? Are there women? Of course. But if you look at the full gamut of males' behavior, jobs, occupational roles, and what have you, a lot of men don't have any power, don't have a lot of power at all, or privilege, or what have you. They're working very difficult jobs, or many have been sent off to armed conflicts. They're dealing with very, very difficult, stressful situations in which they're getting by, not necessarily thriving, but just getting by.
Yeah. So there's, I mean, at least according to this sentence, if we can change men, we can change the world. There is this underlying idea that it's not only the men who are, seeking counseling or feeling that they have mental health issues or emotional issues who need to be, so to say, changed, but it's every single man, right?
Yep. Yeah, there's something about us innately, perhaps, that need fixed. And again, this is sort of if you think of these factors that they identify as negative factors, right? It leads to a set of conclusions. But if you see traditional masculinity in its more noble terms, right? The willingness to sacrifice, the willingness to provide, the willingness to intervene, the willingness to stand up and be counted, right? Oftentimes at a very high cost. Then that leads to a different set of suggestions and potential treatment modalities. If you see it, but if you automatically start from the assumption that masculinity is a problem that has to be fixed, and not that masculinity is a healthy, can be a very healthy orientation that is very adaptive and that men may need in sort of proper doses, then that leads to a very different set of conclusions.
So I mean, again, to keep banging on the sentence, if we can change men, I suppose I'm very sure we can all use some change, and we can all improve ourselves to various extents and in different directions. And I don't know if you want to discuss this, but it's something I just thought about, which is, you fear that these guidelines would sort of dissuade men from seeking professional counsel. And I'm thinking in parallel of the success of someone like Jordan Peterson, who's been talking to young men mostly. Many of them report having felt extremely well. First, I mean, sort of before getting to know his work and his outreach, extremely lost and sort of purposeless and not sure what they were doing in their lives. And after encountering his speeches and his sort of summaries of his thoughts on the internet, they reported feeling well, much more sort of purposeful and sort of not aimless. And it seems to me that by sort of stressing the idea of personal responsibility and the notion that you can improve yourself before thinking about improving everything else, he's hit a chord that maybe, you know, I mean, he maybe his message is a better match for at least a subset of men than the APA guidelines would be.
And I would tend to agree that an empowering message, one of personal accountability,
right,
authenticity, self-control, self-directedness, also backed up by compassion and empathy, is the very message that I think a lot of men understand, and that a lot of young men need to hear. That if you look at the data on men and boys right now, they've really fallen behind in a number of areas, and I think this should stimulate a lot of research into what's going on. But the alienation, right? And this is what I think Jordan Peterson has tapped into. The alienation that a lot of young men feel, that they don't feel connected to our traditional institutions. Marriage, for example, to many young men, it's very much a risk to them. And I think if you, and perhaps this is my own bias, but if you're married, you have children, you end up getting divorced. If you're a man, you lose, and you lose a lot, and you're going to lose your identity as a family man, as a partial provider. Your children, you're not going to see them as often, and sometimes not at all. The state oftentimes takes a very adversarial position toward you, and this affects men deeply, right? And many of these young men that you're referring to have been products of divorce, and they've seen those ties split in ways that have been very detrimental. So that alienation from traditional institutions in employment and education, and even other sources of masculine identity, like the military, has been felt deeply by many young men who have the capacity to do great things with their lives. And I think that's what Peterson says to them. There's nothing wrong with you. Get up off your ass, right? Take responsibility for your life, move forward, evolve, right? Find those opportunities, seek them out, and run with them. Which is very different, very different message, right?
Yes.
Than what the APA is.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to get back to that because I was going to ask you, what is the alternative that is put forward to traditional masculinity in the guidelines? Because of course they sort of propose to jettison something, but do they have a replacement?
Yeah, and that is a very, very good point. What is the alternative? I don't know. But something tells me that if you want to replace traditional masculinity with something that improves the lives of men, then it's sort of on you to say what that is. Okay. And that perhaps that goes into what do men need in their lives to feel connected, purposeful, right? And to deal with some of the stressors and tragedies that they will inevitably encounter in a healthy and adaptive way. So, research on divorce, for example, going back to that point, shows that men take divorce not very well, and you'll oftentimes see them turn to alcohol and abusing alcohol, drugs, sort of shallow relationships, and that they stumble through it until they make it out of those doldrums that they ever do. It's a very serious risk factor. Suicide rates double to triple for men after divorce. So there's something about that process that affects men very dramatically. That we need to understand why is this important to them. I suspect that part of our masculine identities is, provider, protector, compatriot, and it gets wrapped up in our families, right? It gets wrapped up in our careers, and that when those things are taken or eliminated or removed or changed or shuffled, that it affects men much more deeply than people have ever realized.
Mm-hmm. So from what I understand, sort of between the lines, it seems that the guidelines, they don't really put forward an alternative, right?
No, I don't believe they put an alternative, no.
Right, except maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating, but except maybe they would like to sort of nudge men in the direction of becoming activists
more
a little bit. Yeah, well, more like women, perhaps.
In fact, that language is in there too, right?
Yeah.
That activist language is certainly in there, and they need to, buy into this type of ideology. And what's the term that they need to be allies,
right?
Right? Not necessarily good husbands, good boyfriends, good friends, good employees, good men of character, but allies, which sort of presupposes a secondary role or a secondary position, right?
Sure.
In hierarchy.
Yeah, so there is this activist direction. Okay. And maybe this is difficult for you to answer, but can you think of what the consequences would be of psychotherapists and psychiatrists? Maybe psychiatrists are not really concerned by the APA, but at least psychotherapists implementing these guidelines in their practices.
First of all, given that they're pretty much non-scientifically based, deeply troubling from that perspective. Second, in application, let me answer this by framing it like this. If I advocate for a treatment intervention, okay, it's often imperative that the treatment interventions have shown scientific validity, right? That you can show through intervention, through randomized controlled trials, what have you, that the intervention is effective and that it has certain range of effect sizes, and that the consequences, there aren't too many negative consequences. That work has not been done at all. And you really don't know if changing these allegedly negative aspects of masculinity will improve the lives of men or have no effect, or make them worse, make them less happy and and have that, again, that sense of authenticity and self-control and self-respect that people need. So it's odd that with all of the cognitive behavioral research that's been conducted, almost all by psychologists, and the demonstration of the efficacy of cognitive behavioral approaches, that was not necessarily the focus. That therapists, for example, again, therapists need to be cognizant of the power and privilege and sexism that has shaped men, right, in their views, and that they, and that they, identify this type of traditional masculine man as something aberrant and in need of repair. Mm. Perhaps what they need is understanding and healing. Perhaps. I was reading a series of studies in preparation for our discussion here, mm-hmm. and some of the, what these studies show were that, the way men and women process information sometimes can be different, not categorically uniformly, right? There's always overlap in these things, but different in that in treatment, women are much more likely to want to discuss feelings and to examine those and to understand them, where men seem to be more likely to want information so that they can process that information and make sort of where they are in life and what they're feeling. Asking men to elevate those feelings into words and to understand all of that can be beneficial at times, but it can also be sort of the wrong type of information, at least initially, that some men need. And again, there's overlap in this. These are not categorical things, but it was interesting that the research was sort of also what we find in the research on treatment of men versus women, also what we find in terms of how men and women communicate with each other or within same-sex groups. And the types of orientations that you see, these average differences between men and women in how they communicate in other settings.
Mm-hmm. So if I look at the guidelines, so some of them we've established are sort of negative about masculinity. This we've discussed. But like an external observer can read through them very quickly, just maybe the headlines, and some of them seem to be really tailored towards addressing men's problems. So they emphasize, or they mention, or they discuss the mm-hmm. how to help men have a healthy family life. They discuss how to help boys and men diminish their levels of aggression, and also how to choose behaviors that will increase or improve their health. So in as much as these sort of more friendly, so to say, guidelines are concerned, would you also say that the details of how they are to be forwarded, these goals, is based on sort of very partial and incomplete view of the scientific literature?
Fairly so. I think that's fair to say. The mechanisms of treatment for men and women and the types of problems that men and women face, there's always some degree of similarity, but with men need other men, and they need those connections. And part of what, going back to Peterson for a second, the alienation that some young guys feel and experience, is not healthy, and it leads to a whole host of unhealthy behaviors and attitudes and what have you. But that's alienation. That's not masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
And that may seem like I'm playing a game with words, but it's important to identify like what the real cause here might be.
Right.
Certainly, men in marriage relationships, long-term relationships, you don't want to see domestic violence and and you don't want to see the types of relationships that are very dysfunctional, unhealthy, and the types of decisions that can come out of that, right, which can be debilitating, life-altering. So, yes, I would say part of the document says, there's some things here that are positive that we can focus on, but that message gets lost, and the unique needs of men and boys, right, gets lost because of the political language that just permeates that document. I'm quite certain that when I was 25 and if I thought about needing a counselor and I opened that document and I read this, I would say there's no way in hell that a guy like me is going to go, find psychological counseling. That I'm not going to walk into a door and feel like I'm automatically broken. And I'll say, knowing many professional psychologists and counselors, I don't believe many of them would ever do that. I think the guidelines are a little bit independent from actual practice.
Okay.
That most counselors and psychologists are very ethical, very concerned about the lives of men and boys, and actually try to facilitate better decision making, better adaptations to stress, and so forth. In my world, police officers, police officers are not known to be, what's the word I'm looking for, sort of the beta male in society. They're typically, the alpha male. They're typically aggressive. They're typically dealing with very difficult things, as are, first responders. And they encounter stressor after stressor after stressor, and see things sometimes that people go in their entire lives without ever encountering. And it used to be that you just did not talk about it, and that if an officer, first responder, did seek out help, that it dramatically impacted their career opportunities because it was seen as a sign of weakness. In many places, that attitude has changed. And in many places, you now have specialized police or first responder psychologists or trauma psychologists that work hand in hand, that they're given time off or at least time to go find, to decompress. We see the same type of thing with the U.S. military. There's greater awareness of the impact of stress, trauma, and especially prolonged stress and trauma on adaptation behavior of men, and that's now being considered and taken seriously. I think these guidelines haven't caught up with that, and that men in those roles that have to exert social dominance and that have to do things that are very risky and that are sometimes place them in the front lines of situations that we all want to avoid. These roles look at those guys and say, there's something wrong with your masculinity. But it's their masculinity that we need. We need strong men. We need healthy men. We need men that are capable of violence, who can control that violence. And that may sound odd coming from a criminologist, but the history of the world tells us that bad things happen when we no longer exercise the capacity for protection and defense. So we do need men to be healthy, vibrant, sometimes aggressive, sometimes violent, right, in certain limited circumstances, and to be able to address those things and to be able to overcome some of the problems that they're going to encounter out of those roles.
Yeah, this is also something Peterson has emphasized many times, right? That what was he saying? I haven't heard him in a while, but that men need to be, at least to some extent, of course, only to some extent, but at least only potentially dangerous, as he puts it. It's not that you shouldn't be, harmless, but that you should be, well, dangerous in principle. Of course, you should not act on it in most circumstances, but if you're completely harmless, then in situations of crisis, it's likely that you will be useless.
Yes, and the burden often falls on men, right? For obvious reasons, and there's nothing innately wrong with that. But yes, I would absolutely agree that part of a healthy male identity is the ability to channel aggression or to demonstrate or to project aggression when needed, and to control that aggression. So where do young boys learn to control aggression? Do they learn to control aggression in a peer counseling group where they talk about their feelings and insecurities and what have you? Maybe some of them do, but most males historically have learned to control aggression through rough and tumble play with other males, especially fathers. And that rough and tumble play. Think about how much Western societies now regulate that, right? Sometimes for good reasons, but there could be a case made that young boys need that, they thrive on it, and that some of the negatives have been overemphasized and the positives have been underemphasized or misunderstood.
Yeah. Oh God, there was something else I wanted to ask, but I forgot. Let me think for a second. I think it was connected to a similar point. Oh yes. Yeah, I wanted just to say that because you mentioned that in as much as maybe too much stoicism and too much suppression or control of feelings was sometimes expected and demanded of people in these difficult jobs such as the police and the military. So you've mentioned that this has already been corrected to some extent, right? And that these guidelines, even though we can agree that they would be correct in this respect, that sometimes there is too much control of emotions that is demanded of men. So in this, they would be correct. But you argue that this sort of realization and resulting correction, has been already implemented in practice.
Yes, and I think great strides have been made. Clearly, we need to, there's always room for incremental improvement, so forth. But today it's not as consequential if a man, a first responder, a police officer says, "Look, I'll give you a personal example. My neighbor is a first responder, paramedic, fireman who responded to a very, very, very nasty automobile accident that killed an entire family, including very young children." And I spoke with him, after that, and this is an ex-Marine. He has been a first responder for a long time, and he's, look, this thing devastated me. I needed time to process it, and my organization gave me that time, and I just needed to decompress. He had nightmares, the stress-induced, those traumatic-induced types of reactions, but he also understood that was normal, and he was given the opportunity to deal with it with no penalty to his career, which is a major change from where we used to be.
Okay. So in that respect, there is, a positive dimension, or at least some truth to the idea that these sort of gender roles can be sometimes, too restrictive and too fixed.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would disagree whether that's a male or a female, right?
Sometimes, of course.
Those roles can become cement and prevent people from fully realizing their potential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's good to clarify, very explicitly, because it's common that as soon as one argues that there is some sort of non-arbitrariness to these roles, that they have some, some reason for their existence, some, definiteness. As soon as you argue for this position, it can happen that you will be understood as meaning that these roles should be sort of reified and set in stone and this type of thing. So it's good to clarify.
Yeah. No, my some roles exist for very good reasons, right? And but that doesn't mean that they will always exist that way.
Right.
It doesn't mean that they can't be modified, and it doesn't mean that at the extremes that they produce consequences that are quite unhealthy. The question is whether or not you toss out the entire role, right? Especially as you pointed out, when there's no real substitute or no real replacement that's being offered that can show or has demonstrated, benefits, and that becomes a new problem, right? We're a little too quick to say, look, we need to change. You got to change this. Okay, right? What's that next step in the evolution? Is it really time to get men to choose a different masculine ideology? I'm not certain that that's the best approach.
So you mentioned that it's likely that most therapists would not, pay too much attention to these guidelines. I mean, certainly not in the case if they don't find them so good. So, and you also mentioned that the research that is mentioned in these guidelines is very sort of incomplete. It gives a very partial view of the field, if I'm translating what you said correctly. So does that mean that the APA, that these guidelines and people who have positions of responsibility in the APA tend to come from only a small subset of the profession, or is it something else, or is it that maybe many psychologists in academia will disagree, but will maybe avoid saying it? Or what is the situation in academic psychology? Is it that most people will agree with these guidelines? Is it that only a minority? Is it somewhere in between?
For me, that's a difficult question to answer. Not being an academic psychologist and
right.
Working in the research areas. So I'm not certain. I think the folks that authored these guidelines and the people that passed them through, they were warned that the language in the guidelines would be off-putting to a broad cross-section of people, and that the way that the document was crafted and written would stimulate a lot of social criticism. They were warned about this up front, well before publication, and chose to ignore it.
Okay.
And I think that doesn't speak. I don't think that says anything about academic psychology. There's a lot about the APA, and that oftentimes, and you'll see this with professional organizations, that when they put out policy positions, for example, they'll load the committee with people who agree on the policies that they want. And again, APA's done this, American Sociological Association, you name it, right? That's how the game's played sometimes. So they wanted these guidelines to get through, and they were going to get through. But I think that says more about the APA than it says about academic psychology. I'm not sure. My guess is that most academic psychologists probably agree with a little fraction of it, but disagree with much of it. And they're quite capable of reading the research themselves, which, by the way, I would, read the studies that they cite, because they say, right, 40 years of research in this area. Okay. But what they don't say is that it's almost all of it's done on college samples.
Right.
Okay. Most of the studies are cross-sectional. If there are longitudinal studies, they're for a very small period of time, and that the measures of masculine ideology are deeply problematic. And that if you go through the items let me make 2 points on this. This is actually really important. If you go through the items that compose the scales on masculine ideology, you'll see 2 things. First, the vast majority of people, males included in these samples, disagree, do not support or endorse statements that are that you would think would comport with the worst of masculine ideology. Okay, there's rejection of these types of statements, so vast majorities of males. Okay, that's important to know, because the vast majority of males in their own samples do not agree with these types of positions, right? Second, you will also find that the items that they use often measure, or at least, I'd say they measure politically conservative ideology about family roles, the roles of husband and wife and things. And I investigated this, and we're actually working on a paper that tests some of these assumptions. And the correlation between the scale in a very large data set measure that has these measures in it, and political ideology is like, if I remember, 0.456. So they're really talking about politically conservative ideology.
Right.
And that's how this is getting swept up into these measures. So it's not just traditional masculinity, right? It's traditional conservatism. So if you're traditionally religious, right, you're automatically scoring high in measures of toxic masculinity. Yet what do we know? It's not traditionally religious men who are violent, in prison, beating their wives, engaging in the types of conduct that we want to sanction and need to sanction.
Yeah, I've reached the end of my questions. Is there something else you would like to explore before we end it?
Yeah. Let me leave it on a positive note, and that is, while I disagree with much of the science-sided and the overt politically progressive orientation, I think the document served a good purpose, and I think the criticism of the document, which was vast, widespread, immediately, and has continued, also signifies something positive, and that is people are paying attention more now than ever before to the psychological and emotional needs and role needs of men and boys. And that's a good thing. And that type of debate we need to have. That type of debate about what is healthy for young boys may not necessarily be the same thing that's healthy for young girls. Or the things that are healthy in treatment and therapy for men may not be the same things for as they are for women. And it's worthwhile to have this type of public debate. It's worthwhile to have the type of research that's necessary to inform these positions and these roles. And what I really hope comes out of this is that the APA reconsiders these guidelines, amends them, and offers more concrete, positive, more scientifically based positions than the original guidelines did. Just because the guidelines were written and published does not mean that they have to be maintained without revision.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So yes, that's a nice way to end it. Thank you very much, John, for coming to the podcast.
And I apologize for how difficult it was to get this done. But.
Oh yeah, it's nothing. I mean, it's all worth it in the end to have a long, nice conversation. Yeah. So
good.
Thanks a lot.
So take it.
Yeah. Thanks again, and have a nice day.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking, and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers, and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter at @AcadFreedom and also on Facebook.